This video is one in a series of videos available at ethicsandclimate.org that examine the practical importance of understanding the ethical dimensions of climate change. I am Don Brown, Scholar in Residence, Sustainability Ethics and Law, Widener University School of Law. This particular video will examine what is generally referred to as the climate change disinformation campaign, and in particular why this campaign has been so destructive, is so harmful to the human race, and why perhaps it could be understood, should be talked about as a new kind of crime against humanity. The international scientific community understood the very basic physics of the greenhouse effect by 1860, yet the international community didn't wake up to the enormous threat entailed by climate change until the late 1950s, when an American by the name of Keeling put a CO2 monitoring station on top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. In 1965, President Johnson gave a speech and warned Americans about the enormous threat of climate change based upon the information coming out of Hawaii. At the time that President Johnson gave the speech, CO2 levels in the atmosphere had risen to 320 parts per million. Opposition to climate change really got started to be organized in the early 1980s under the U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who included among his staff several people that came out of the fossil fuel industry and were known to oppose government action on climate change. By the time this opposition got organized in the early 1980s, carbon dioxide levels had risen to 340 parts per million. The fossil fuel industry and several other industries and right-wing philanthropic organizations would continue to oppose climate change for several decades in the future. By the middle 1980s, the EU called for an international climate treaty to reduce the growing threat of climate change. They put into process a series of meetings which resulted in formal negotiations beginning in 1990, and finally the adoption by the world of the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This treaty had many strong provisions about climate change, but not enforceable targets. Enforceable targets were resisted by the United States. By 1995, the science supporting concerns about climate change had become so strong, the international community agreed that it needed to negotiate an amendment to the United Nations Treaty, and has thus finally negotiated in 1997 the Kyoto Protocol, which for the first time had enforceable targets for developed countries. The United States, however, never ratified that treaty. It had been pushed by the fossil fuel industry in the United States not to do so. By the time the treaty, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, CO2 had risen to 363 parts per million. When President George Bush II became president in 2001, he soon announced the U.S. was withdrawing from any participation in the Kyoto Protocol, making the U.S. the only developed country without an enforceable greenhouse gas reduction target. George Bush had been pushed by the fossil fuel industry and others opposed to climate action. At the time that he did it, CO2 levels had risen to 371 parts per million. The period from 2000 to 2011 in the U.S. Congress was marked by one failure after the other to adopt meaningful climate change legislation. Opposition from the fossil fuel industry and the well-organized disinformation campaign prevented meaningful legislation. In the meantime, carbon dioxide had risen to 390 parts per million. And so for over 3 decades, the fossil fuel industry and other industries that wanted to use fossil fuel at the lowest possible cost had convinced many U.S. politicians and many U.S. citizens that the science of climate change did not support action. However, the most prestigious scientific organizations had continued to conclude something quite different from this, starting in 1978, when the U.S. Academy of Science reviewed the science and concluded that human-induced climate change was a significant threat
to human health and global ecological systems. Because the United States had resisted making commitments to reduce its emissions using the excuse that the science of climate change was too uncertain, the international community created, at the suggestion of the United States, the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose mission was to review the peer-reviewed scientific literature and make recommendations based upon that to governments about what to do about climate change. In 1990, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued its first report, which concluded that climate change was a significant threat and action should be taken.
In 1995, IPCC issued its second assessment report, which confirmed and strengthened its conclusions that human activities were threatening people and ecological systems around the world. In 2001, the United States Academy of Sciences again issued a report that analyzed the science of climate change and confirmed the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that humans were creating a threat from climate change. In 2001, IPCC issued its third assessment report, which concluded and strengthened the conclusions of the first two assessment reports, including the fact that the warming which is now visible was human caused, which was not the result of natural causes. In 2007, IPCC issued its fourth report. In 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its fifth assessment report, which confirmed and strengthened the conclusions that humans are creating dangerous climate change, and that the warming was now visible, and that warming was virtually certain. And so the IPCC has issued 5 different assessment reports, all of which strengthened, added to, and confirmed conclusions with high levels of scientific confidence that human activities were causing climate change. And so, for almost 40 years, fossil fuel companies, a few in particular including Exxon, Peabody Coal, and other oil companies, corporations with economic interests tied to their use of fossil fuel, industry-wide organizations such as the American Petroleum Institute and other corporations have worked cooperatively to prevent the United States and some other countries from adopting policies to limit the threat of climate change. This has all been well documented by sociologists in peer-reviewed literature. They know how it worked, who funded it, and what role different companies have played in this counter movement. When climate change was first discussed among politicians in the United States, as we have seen, carbon dioxide levels were approximately 320 parts per million. Now, largely as a result of the successful opposition of the climate change disinformation campaign, atmospheric concentrations of CO2 have now risen to 403 parts per million, a very dangerous level. In 2015, in December, 190 some countries agreed in Paris to try to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade and to pursue efforts to try to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. As we will see, attempting to do this creates a hard-to-imagine, civilization-challenging problem, which is now facing the world largely because of the 40-year delay that the climate change disinformation campaign, what sociologists call a counter-movement, have done to delay government action. This chart demonstrates the enormity of the challenge facing the world to prevent dangerous warming of between 2 and 1.5 degrees centigrade. The yellow dotted line at the top is the reductions that are required for countries to make their commitments that they made before the Paris conference. The red dotted line is the reductions would be required to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade with a 50% probability. The blue dotted line is a 2 degrees centigrade warming limit with a 66% probability. And the green dotted line equals the amount of reductions that would be required of the entire world to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Note the enormous steepness of the reduction curves required to limit warming to 1.5 and 2 degrees. In fact, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, a warming limit which is viewed by the international community the upper bound of what might be necessary to prevent dangerous climate change. The United Nations Environmental Program has concluded that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, the whole world must reduce its carbon emissions to zero between 2045 and 2050. And so we can see that the climate change disinformation campaign has created an enormous danger for the world. As we will see in future videos, the tactics of the climate change disinformation campaign or counter-movement can't be construed as responsible scientific skepticism, which is a good thing and should be encouraged, but include morally reprehensible tactics, including lying or reckless disregard for the truth of mainstream science about climate change, focusing on unknowns while ignoring what is known, using front groups, manufacturing bogus science in fake conferences, use of think tank and PR campaigns, the use of something called astroturf groups, and making bogus economic claims. And so we have seen the climate change counter movement has created a problem for the human race of potentially catastrophic proportions in terms of droughts, floods, killer heat waves, loss of food supply, rising seas. This counter movement probably should be understood as some kind of new crime against humanity. We will look more at this in future videos on the subject.